Welcome to Circle Passages. My name is Heather and we are with Buck as usual, and we have a wonderful talk on something we usually don't talk about, which is death. And it's death, the great adventure, death in this reframe really as life itself. So welcome, Buck. And with that, we get to dive into how can death be life and life be death?
That is the question.
Yeah.
When you mentioned that earlier, it's kind of like, so how do we pull this one together? Pull it
Right.
off?
Yeah. Well, and to contextualize, it's the full moon of Aries, but it's Easter weekend, which I think is also this time of, crucifixion, death, resurrection, and that is the framework of rites of passage. Is that 3 days of that descent of death and rebirth that is the trajectory of not only the archetype of Jesus Christ, but other mythic figures throughout time. And so that's at the heart of what we're doing with our rite of passage. I didn't answer your question.
No, well, that's
Yeah.
but I'm sure you can get
Yeah.
to it. And actually, with what you just described too, is Jesus, so 2,000 years ago, roughly. But the indigenous cultures, and like you said, rites of passage, that's
Right.
been going on for as long, if not maybe even preceding.
Absolutely
Yeah.
proceeding, yeah. Yeah, and that does bring up one of the questions, because it is Easter, of who is this for? And the short version is everyone, because this is this archetypal form of death and rebirth. So it's, there's something like 142 different sun gods, but characters that follow that trajectory across cultures and across times, archetypally, that are crucified, whether upright or like Odin was hanging, die for 3 days and then are resurrected. And so then that is kind of everyone's birthright, is that framework of transformation. And that's what the rite of passage, as you know, is based on. So it belongs to everyone. Everyone is invited, and because it's self-generated ritual and self-generated storytelling, everyone gets to find their own way, narrate their own story, receive their own name in whatever culture and context they feel comfortable, or comes to them, whether they feel comfortable or not.
Which is pretty fascinating, because I remember you saying before you went on your rite of passage, just at home, of, again, you have to die first. And it's kind of like family members say, what? So what is this?
That family member was my husband. He's like, no, because the question was that you're referring to, because the first initiation of this rite of passage is the death lodge. It's all about death and rebirth. So that the way they framed it in the School of Lost Borders we're trained in is, are you ready to die? Prepare to die. And he's like, you're doing what? Yeah. And it is like the preparation, separation, transformation, integration. Preparing to die is the first step. And in a way, that's part of why this is so relevant, is not only did we have COVID, I had cancer, we all have something, divorce, disease, death in some form. Even sleep is called a mini death sometimes. But we have the Ukraine, we have Easter, we have, death just right up in the foreground in so many ways. So death as liberation is the center of this. And so that's what I thought we could confront, because when we gather and circle in rites of passage, it's what is present, what wants to speak, what is here now. And death is really present in the room, this planetary space as well as our personal space. And we can't avoid it. So I thought I'd start with this great quote by Carl Jung, who really took up a lot of the work. He said the new commandment was to serve the dead. And so that's our second show. It's going to be Ancestors. How exactly do we do this? But it brings death in, and then it allows us to actually dialogue and interface with death. So he said shrinking away from death is something unhealthy and abnormal, even though it's the most common thing. And it robs the second half of life of its purpose. Look into the depths, awaken the dead. And so It's a reframe, and Carl Jung, and then also Death, the Great Adventure, when I ended up having my diagnosis and thinking I would die after the rite of passage, I did a couple of things, divinations, and I wrote it, pulled a tarot card, and it was not death, but it was judgment. And so it's where people have, because I received the words fierce grace, which is kind of like wild gratitude, dancing with life and death. And so that tarot card has a man and a woman who are gray. They're literally half black, half white, half dead, half alive, standing in their coffins, awakened. So they're resurrected, essentially, having gone through death. And so that was one of the little divinations. And the other funny thing I did was I went to my bookshelf and kind of, blindly pulled a book. And it was a book that I then read, and it was Death, the Great Adventure from Theosophy and Alice Bailey. And so that's kind of a way to reframe this, is it's like, okay, how can this be that triumphant, because there's an archangel, it's a literal jubilation, judgment, is they're awakened by the horn, and so it's like, how can we reawaken? How can we come back to life? Even if we're still alive is the more pertinent question. Like, how can we really live? Again, Jung, he said, you must live this life. That was, if I know anything at all, you must live this life. And so it's awakening to your own life, being born again, which you hear a lot, but in this rite of passage, which is ancient and archetypal, it's awakening to your life's purpose. Being willing to be weird, which we were talking about, is really to have one foot in one world and one foot in the other etymologically. Claiming you're weird and getting your weird on, And so that's, Buck, what I want to talk about. And I have one of our little visuals to help us.
And yet, when you the way you're describing it, it seems like society is fearful of death. Collectively it seems,
Yeah.
or it's not a good thing.
Right.
It's always really sad, or it's just not something I even want to think about, I want to deal with. So
what to do with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. I had these kind of passings close to death. One was the rite of passage, where it invites you to die. One was some dancing around suicide close to me and doing rites of passage. But before any of that, I had a friend who died of brain cancer. And in that, I really realized, because I saw her essentially every day, I don't know how to talk about this. I can show up and be kind and be myself, but I don't have a framework for this. And I did grow up with parents with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Death and Dying, and Stages of Grieving, so I knew more than maybe most people. But what I did was I set about looking at different ways different cultures worked with death. And a lot of cultures hold death really close. Like literally the dancing with life and death was from a story someone told me, where they realized that as they're celebrating dancing to the burial ground, that one of the people's that's literally being passed around is the body of the deceased. So we hold death off. And the reason to bring it close, and that's what I'm hoping to invite people through this, is because when you get closer to death, you come to life. And when you get closer to fear, because there is a lot of fear about death, you come to love. It's like literally that simple. And so, yes, we have a culture that staves off death, even aging. Like we've both talked about elderhood. For a woman, I've been through menopause, and so it's like, I'm a crone, yay, I'm a wicked witch. It's just like, we just don't have, this whole second half of life is essentially denied. And yet in all these different traditions, it's the Sannyasin, or it's the one who I think, Buck, you're such an exemplar of, that goes back in service to the community, to the tribe, to the ancestors. That this rite of passage is a call to that second awakening and to the rebirth of like okay, let's really live this. Like, what am I really called to do? I may have spent X amount of time doing whatever, and that's great, but what am I really called to do?
No, that's pretty huge right there. And you mentioned them. That's for most of us, most of society. That's a huge transition, or to even consider it. It's almost like as the end is closer, death
Right.
is getting closer. That you're talking about actually really. I don't know, spiking it, of really getting into the game, if you
Yeah.
would. And it seems like we just don't approach it that way. It's kind of like people back off and, really regress and stay within themselves because they fear death is coming, and that's not a good thing, again, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we're so ill prepared. So you're reminding me of a couple of things. But one is that our circle model is about intergenerational wholeness. And I think of that like when we work with the ancestors and ancestral generational healing, that's part of it. But most of it is right now, like healing families intergenerationally. And part of that is that we have elderly people and we kind of have a system that farms them out and separates them out. And we had my stepfather live with us. How can we complete this cycle? Like a sustainable model, like recycling. How can you have this be a model of wholeness? And part of that is allowing the youth, like when I was little, I was in a clown troupe, and we went to elder care facilities, and older people could be tutoring, like how can we connect this intergenerational circle? But then also, how can we dialogue about it? Because there's so many resources, like near-death experiences are amazing. I've had different experiences that aren't near-death, but that show you that life is this crazy liberation. Like when my friend died, I could feel her spirit just release. It felt like a positive nuclear, small probably, just this tremendous liberation, death as liberation. And when we were with the eagle, with Lori's mom from the drumming, the eagle was flying first when I was seeing it, and the great horned owl in an inner vision, but I really realized the eagle's not life, it's death that is life. And the owl is not death, in this way that we think it's life, or, that we think of as death. And it just was this like reframe of what we think of is life is a shadow world of death. And it's just like the opposite of how we normally frame it.
Again, that seems like that's quite a transformation, or
Yeah.
even just to tweak my thinking, or most of us, that looking at it that way, which makes a whole lot more sense than the way we seem to approach it. It's
Right.
like, that's the end. It's over.
Yeah, and that's where the self-generated ritual, everybody has to come in their own way. So it's really is somewhat like the 12-step programs where there's a surrender to something bigger, and it could be nature, it could be service, it could be whatever, the wind, whatever. But for me, like with that experience of Lori, and we were out doing ritual for her mom while she was passing, the fact that an eagle shows up and sits with us in ceremony, or that you have a vision and you can kind of see, there's so much that shows up that seems magical and otherworldly, but is really just a part of the world and nature that isn't our normal perception. And so that's part of this reframe, is also people are visited by ancestors as they get closer to death. There are all kinds of studies that show that. People are helped in ways seen and unseen, but largely unseen. And if we're too fearful of death, I think we don't avail ourselves of that hope and that support and that transformational potential, because that's what death holds, this huge transformational potential. And in a lot of cultures, you literally live your life to live through the moment of death at a certain consciousness, and you meditate through death, And so I'm not saying we have to get there tomorrow, but to open up, to say, okay, death is here present. let's begin a dialogue. Let's embrace death in terms of, like when I got my cancer, the great adventure. Trust me, it did not feel like a great adventure when I first got my diagnosis. Yeah.
You're right in the middle of it, yeah, so that's understandable. And
Yeah.
And again, it's that if we can kind of change our view or work on that, our view of death, and see it not as an end all, it's actually, in my mind, and what for a long, long time is believing in incarnation. So in order to incarnate, I need to, in this body, I need to die first, right?
Right.
So, but it's not like, okay, and then that's it. It's kind of like looking forward to, okay, so I'm going to be back, and how's that going to take place, you know, and in what form and all those other kinds of things. But it kind of takes, again, that fear of this is it, you know, it's one and done, and you're gone. And I know there are a lot of cultures that feel that that's the case, and a lot of cultures that do feel like it's, like you said, death is liberation.
Yeah, and it's all about coming up with a framework for the individual. I mean, that's really what the rites of passage, when you go out on that initiatory experience, whether it's, again, in a cabin, in the wilderness, in a weekend retreat, whatever, it's about confronting death, preparation, preparing to die, separating what are you going to relinquish and embrace unto you, but it's about creating your own framework. And people might be surprised. So when I thought I was going to die, I thought I had a framework that, not like it was going to be easy peasy or something, but I thought I had a framework that would really work for that kind of situation. And I didn't, and I haven't changed my framework, but I realized that I had not embodied nearly as deeply as I thought I had, what I thought I believed. There's this trust. This is like a trust exercise with death. And it's almost like creating your own narrative. What you believe is finding a way to trust death. And so it could be that you die and then you are kind of the compost for the great alchemy of the forest. We walk in the forest all the time, and death and rebirth are just like so intertwined, nurse logs, and it's like they're indistinct from each other. They're just one whole, which is the forest. So it's coming up with the framework of what do you believe, and then also opening to experiences, because death is a great initiator. Like maybe it's the great initiator, even if it's a death of a belief system that doesn't serve you, or a death of a divorce or a friendship that you can no longer abide, or whatever it is. There are many deaths, and what strikes me is that if we do our work tending to death, kind of walking with death through the ages, then we won't get to the end and be taken by surprise. It's like befriending death, and we'll do our death work, this processing, so that we get to the ends and we're done. That the death lodge is about a good death, which is essentially like you've done the work.
So more accepting of that process, that time of your life,
yeah,
or actually ending that aspect of it.
Yeah, and it also strikes me as tilling the soil is another good way to look at it, because I know, we work so much with suicidal ideation. So death is present all over the place right now. Yeah. So it strikes me as almost like taking the time to be with death when it's present. So it could be present when a family member dies when you're a child, or it could be present with the suicide of a friend, or your own suicide or suicidal ideation attempt, or it could be present when your parents divorce, or it's almost like if we hold death at bay, there comes a point we can't, and we're overrun and overwrought. But if we process, which is like this tilling of the soil, then we're doing our death practice almost like, which is to live a life. And it literally feels like, to me, from my experience, if you don't do the death work, you can't fully live. And that's what I think we're risking, is not that we're going to die, but that we're not going to live. And that's the bigger deal right now, I think, is that we really live, and we, especially a lot of the youth that are at risk, you know, to invite people back into life, because a lot of people have lost track of life and they don't know how to sit down and befriend and embrace death.
You know, it reminds me too, when you were talking about tilling the soil of, we've talked about this before, the Maya and having the ball game that they had, and somebody's got to lose. And
Right.
in this case, the losing team would be beheaded. And you think, how awful. You know, you don't want to be on the losing team. But at the same time, they were agriculturalists. So
Right.
the idea was the blood will fertilize the earth, so till the earth. So it was, in a way, an honor to offer, because at some point you're going to die. We're all going to do that, right? But in this case, it's so it's not being defeated. It's really giving even more of yourself to so others can live.
Yeah.
So interesting concept and the way they approach this.
Yeah, and archetypal. So it's all across the planet at different times, and that's what that whole the sacrifice. Usually, it was the king, like Osiris, cut into many parts. It's usually an agricultural masculine myth, and the feminine, like Isis, sometimes will gather the parts. But it's that connection to the land that obviously we need to reclaim too. And so all of these different parts of not facing death are really huge and impactful. And there are crises with suicide and suicidal ideation. Ukraine is just, you know, where it's Easter, it just seems like this great time to really bring death close, or recognize that it is close, and begin to have our dialogue. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, we have our, you know, Day of the Dead image, is that a lot of cultures, as you bring the Mayan, this is more of a Tibetan, this is the gift of death. It's, to me, the classic, like, return to sender. You're like, wrong address. But this way that is around us in different traditions of how do we connect through death, for example, with our ancestors. And I just had a friend who had cancer, and she was like, can I call on my brother and my mom? My brother just died, and because she was going through all this intensive treatment, and it's like, yes, you can. And they came, you know. So part of our staving off death is a disconnect ancestrally to the land, but also to our own lineage, who we think of it as a burden in a way often, like ancestral healing is we're trying to heal it, but it can help heal us. You know, essentially it's a line of connection. And so, again, the million reasons to face and befriend death.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And you know, just the name of the show and the name of the organization is Circle Passages. I mean, and thinking about that, it's circle,
Right.
it's cyclical, so in this circle, so, and then the passage part, we're talking about, this is a pretty significant passage, isn't
Yeah.
it? To move from this body right here to death, and then if it's, let's say, like Jesus,
Yeah.
3 days later, resurrected. So
Right.
the death is no longer death. Now it's life in a whole different way of looking at it. But that
Right.
keeping the circle going, you know, it's continuous, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I know we've had visuals for that, but it's literally the circle passage is the life, you know. So it's like birth, childhood, you know, young adulthood, elderhood, and it just returns and it returns. It's in our seasons. And so if we refuse death, we're refusing the return and the renewal and this continuation of the cycle.
So it's no longer a circle, is it? If we're refusing and we're trying to, well, let's separate this thing, or let's
Right.
break off, right? And
Right.
so what? Who knows what that even looks like? But a lot of
Looks like
society
a catastrophe.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, yeah,
Don't go there, right?
yeah, yeah. And it, to state the obvious, it's futile. Like, we know that we're born to die, and that's a beautiful thing, you know. And instead of taking that as a beautiful thing, like, what is the gift of death? And I have a number of friends who've had near-death experiences, and I was just talking to one who had 5 2 days ago, and no one I know is like, you know, yes, I'm so excited to come back. They're like, ah, you know, but this is the place they have work to do, or they have something. They come back for that reason. But when we get to know death, we see it as actually the friend that it is, the initiator that it is, and the liberation that it is. But we just have to sit. It's like sitting with our fear, and that's the gift of love, you know. But we don't get one without the other. Like if you can't confront death, you really cannot live a full life. I mean, I think that's fundamentally true. And if you can't confront your fear, you cannot fully love. I think those are just like 2 sides of the same coin. And so that's the deep invitation, is to a richer, fuller life and love, which who doesn't want that?
True. And it seems like death is always portrayed as darkness. And thinking about, you know, getting buried, where some cultures is, like, let's say the Vikings. I don't know if that where in our world that's still the case, but you know, you're floating and set on fire, or
India,
a
in
pirate.
different places, yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So I don't know. It's like a whole different perception or different way of approaching. Again, here's that darkness, and it doesn't seem too inviting.
Right, yeah, and the whole, you know, that there's a tunnel of light. Like, we do know a lot from near-death experiences now, and there are a lot of traditions. Crematoriums are becoming more popular, but a lot of traditions where fire has always been that way. Pyramid as that root, pyre, fire. And it's the purification by fire, you know, it's that kind of final consecrating act of your life, and it's celebratory. And that's the other thing is, grieving, I think, is from the Old French, to burden, and so to lay down the burden, you know, that it doesn't have to be compounded by this mournful sense. Like, we think of death as like everyone has to be terribly sad, and it's like we may really miss the people, and it may be really sad, so I'm not saying that's not true on some level. And there is a lot to celebrate, because, at least according to near-death experiences and my limited experiences, it really is that kind of resurrection energy of something beyond, however you want to conceive of it.
You know, this also reminds me of something I've had a chance to look at. It was more like a documentary, but it was Seti, one of the pharaohs. So this is about 3,000 years ago, Seti II, and portraying that journey from death. And actually, this is on the water, so in an underwater, underwater cave, I guess you could say. But in going through all these still trials and tribulations, before what it ended up and where it ended up was dawn. So you're coming out to the open and the sun and light. Right. What an amazing, and not just story, but this is what was believed to be the case.
And is mythically and archetypally alive. Like Aurora, Eostra, there are different versions of the name, but it's the dawn, you know, Easter and the dawn. It's that resurrection, alleluia chorus of the new hope and the light at the end of the tunnel, and, you know, all of the things we really need. And as you know, I brought my little raven boat back that just a beloved teacher from Evergreen carved for me when I was going through my initiatory underworld passage. But yeah, how can we take this journey, and even more powerfully, how can we take it together? Because that's the other thing, is that death, I think, is best held in community, and I think that's one of the root fears, is that we will be alone.
That's what probably the biggest fear right there, it seems, isn't it, for most of us, is that I'm going to be alone. That again, it's over. And, you know, when I first met you, it's been maybe like 3 years ago, and really talking about revitalizing is bringing this back to the forefront again of rites of passage. It seems like this would be, it's kind of like, how do I get my head around all of these kinds of things that, well, it's not death. Death is life. It's that cycle.
Right.
Is through rites of passage where you personally can experience that of, like you were saying, with a vision quest, going out on the land
Yeah.
for 3 days by yourself and fasting. So here's a way, but it's really kind of getting it to more and more folks of take this journey.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to really appreciate it.
Yeah, embark. Yeah, because on the paper, it's on paper and it looks like visual concepts, which it is, you know. But what it really is an inner journey and awakening. And yeah, it can look like inviting death in, you know, like, and that could be everybody has their own. Like my father-in-law died during COVID, and I know I haven't processed that fully. I've had like a number of iterations of death. This has got to be like the common denominator with people that, and I've not processed any of them fully, I bet. So one of the things a rite of passage does is it gives you the time to be, however you do it again, be with this death and see what its lessons are, because it is this great initiator. And so, yeah, that my first step, come on a journey with us, please. And in the meantime, that preparation, that first step is come into this friendship with death, and that can begin any time in any way.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And the fact, you know, thinking about rites of passage and the vision quest, actually, so we're going out on for the 3 days. And, you know, there are some other days where the circle, other folks who are you're doing that with at the same time, even though you separate at some point, to go out and do your own 3-day vigil, is you're not limited to just one time. You know, it's
No.
kind of like each time, I know there's something that I wasn't aware of before is going to be presented, and that's exciting.
Yeah, and there's like steps on our journey, you know, like to initiate is just to begin again. So if you think of how many grades we've gone through, you know, we can go through a lot of levels of learning, and that's the hope. And death gets to be just one of them.
Great artwork too.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Buck. And we're at the end of our time, but thank you for coming to Circle Passages, and please invite death in. I know it's not the way of the larger culture, but there is a gift there for you. Thank you.